Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Carol Marshart, and I am the Executive Director of AXYS, the Association for X and Y Chromosome Variations, and you can find us at genetic.org. Want to invite all of you personally to come to Atlanta for our 2019 Family Conference at the end of June. You can find the information on our website, and tonight's presenters will be talking a little bit more about some of the material you're going to hear at this conference. It's going to be a wonderful event. Families get together, get to know each other, and I promise you're going to leave with some new best friends. Just wanted to make sure you know how to contact us. We have a P.O. box in Mendenhall. You can call our toll-free number, which is also a helpline. People call and can leave a message, and we will get a trained volunteer to answer your phone call and answer questions. You can also email us at genetic.org. Want to let you know that we have a clinic and research consortium. It is a group of researchers and clinicians who get together to help us further research on X and Y chromosome variations. And I'm very happy to announce that just today we added a new clinic in Boston at Mass General Hospital. We have support groups throughout the United States and actually internationally as well. So we would encourage you to visit our website, get connected with people with the same condition or living in your same area. Some groups are virtual, so you can find us on Facebook and find somebody 24/7 to answer your questions and offer you the support you're looking for. Again, just visiting our website is where you can find everything, and our presenters are going to talk about that. And without any further ado, we'd like to bring you to our main presenter. So let's switch this over to Dr. T, and we're going to get on with the main show.
Okay, can you hear us? Hello? Okay, so welcome to our webinar this evening. The title of the webinar is Engaging the X and Y Chromosome Variation Community in Research from Birth to Adulthood. I am happy to, maybe down here. Figure out how to advance these slides. Okay. And so I am Dr. Nicole Tartaglia. I am a developmental pediatrician at Children's Hospital, Colorado, and the director of the Extraordinary Kids Clinic here in Colorado. I'm also an associate professor of pediatrics for the University of Colorado School of Medicine.
And I'm Shanlee Davis. I am also in the Extraordinary Kids Clinic, working as the pediatric endocrinologist, and I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics at the School of Medicine here in Colorado as well. So we're going to get started with talking about our topic today. So we hope during this webinar to be able to talk to you about what is research and why is it important, how you can be an informed consumer of research, how do you decide if you want to participate in a research study, and then talk about some current research study opportunities for individuals with X and Y chromosome variations. So first, to start off with the basic question of what is research? So research has a pretty specific definition, including the systematic investigation to describe, explain, predict, and control an observed phenomenon with the intent to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So breaking that down a little bit more, systematic means that it really is a planned system or process. We typically use standard scientific methods and do things in a specific study design way, and also engage in appropriate ethical conduct for both conducting the study and reporting study results. Investigation is referring to just asking a question, and then what is the question trying to answer. And then contributing to generalizable knowledge means that in order for it to be research, we really...
But we got to go downstairs. Use it downstairs?
You really need it to apply to more than just one person.
Yeah. If you download the app, you can get video.
So looking at clinical translational research means research that is done in humans, research that ultimately is going to improve the health of humans. And when we think about improving global health, and over here on the far right-hand side of this spectrum, first we have to start way back here, really in basic science and the lab, and starting first in looking at animal models, and then we can able to translate that into humans. First in early studies, which is often referred to P1 research.
That's your protege. I don't know if you want to hear it or not.
And then we move on to translation to patients, so the patients that are actually potentially going to benefit from this research study. And then moving on to implications to practice, translating it into how we're going to better take care of patients, and then finally to the general population. So why is research important? So scientific research is really essential for improving the quality of human lives. We know that we need to do research to look at knowledge about health and disease, both understanding the natural history of what outcomes there are if we don't do any interventions at all, understanding deeper into what causes disease or what causes problems, and then also what helps things be beneficial, understanding who is at risk for disease, and then trying to understand what we call biologic plausibility, so things that make sense scientifically to be able to be part of that disease process. We then also use research to develop and test treatments or different approaches, asking the questions what works and what doesn't work, and then also asking what are the risks and benefits of those interventions. And then finally, the goal is really to improve health and well-being of people, ultimately to hopefully prevent and cure disease, treat conditions, and improve quality of life. So why don't we just skip this research process? There are a lot of things that we anecdotally know or think improve our health or the health of an individual. However, even though it might improve it in one circumstance, or we might think that it improves it, without the research process to truly understand why it's improving and how it's improving and proving that it works in a larger group of people, we can get ourselves into trouble. So these are some examples historically of things that were done for many, many years that were thought to be really beneficial. So bloodletting was used routinely to treat certain infections as well as other conditions. And it is told that bloodletting was actually what ended up killing George Washington. We also widely used tobacco for centuries, and people thought that it was not only not harmful but beneficial to treat many maladies. And now we know that it is one of the leading killers of people in our country, as well as around the world. So without the research that was able to identify that, they thought it was beneficial. Aspirin is another example that was frequently used, frequently given to kids with viral infections, just like we give Tylenol and Advil today. But before 1986, they didn't think that there was any consequences to that. At that time, research identified that aspirin, in combination with certain viral infections, led to a very rare but fatal condition in these children that we now know we should not be giving aspirin to young kids. And honey as well is one thing that we routinely recommend as pediatricians to give for coughs and colds, and has actually been really beneficial. However, in certain population, infants in particular, less than 12 months, it can cause a rare condition called botulism. And so all of these things, although they can potentially be good or have thought to be good in the past, research has really identified that that's not the case. So these are all things why we need research to help define what is and isn't beneficial. And Dr. T is going to talk more about specific research examples that have been done and are important in X and Y chromosome research.
Yeah, I wanted to just, start by sharing a little bit of perspective about how research in the past on X and Y chromosome variations has really influenced how we practice. And so it's important to know a little bit about the history of when these conditions were first described. They were described in populations that had severely affected individuals with the more severe aspects of the phenotype or of the variability. And so generally these were in Klinefelter syndrome in, men who had all of the physical features related to the classic description of Klinefelter syndrome. And then later on, many of the psychological features that were initially described related to more severe aspects of disability or behavioral and emotional challenges were described from populations that were actually very biased in terms of the severity of the population that was being described. And so this led to some very smart group of researchers from across the country who realized that, this is probably, the original descriptions are probably a limited view of what really happens in these conditions. And so we need to know more about what happens throughout the lifespan and what happens in populations where they're not ascertained or diagnosed only because they're having problems. And so this led to a group of studies that were done way back in the late 70s and 80s and, into the early 2000s, where infants were tested at birth in many different hospitals across the United States and in Canada and the UK and Europe as well. And then the babies that were identified were then followed all the way from infancy through adulthood. And it was these studies that really showed us a lot about the variability of the different manifestations in terms of developmental and cognitive and learning outcomes in these patients, and also in terms of the variability of medical outcomes. And basically, these studies, did show that there were higher rates of early developmental delays, and so, but they were not universal developmental delays, but led us to be able to use a lot of their findings in the practices that we use today in terms of monitoring and being very proactive in monitoring for developmental delays in our patients when they're young, and then obviously monitoring for in the XXY and XXYY population and those other groups who have extra X's in males, monitoring for testosterone deficiency in terms of when that starts, and then later on in adulthood, monitoring for some of the adult comorbidities in terms of medical findings and psychological findings as well. So these were really important studies that were done in the past that really have guided our treatment practices and monitoring practices in X and Y variations. I want to give another example of the importance of research in terms of how it influences not only the experience of the participant, but how it really does lead to improvements in knowledge and in care across all the people to which the research reaches. So for example, this is a paper that's a review paper of trisomy X that was published in 2010 in a journal called the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases, which is one of those journals that's considered what we call open access, or anyone who finds this on the internet has access to the journal. And we wrote this paper after we'd had 36 participants in our original studies who had trisomy X syndrome. And after working with all of those participants and knowing what was actually already out there in the literature, we said, we really just need to write a review paper because we will use the information we've learned from these 36 participants so far, and then previous literature, because we need more updated information about trisomy X out there. And so what I want to point out here is the impact of participation. These 36 participants inspired us to write this paper, and since 2010, we can tell that 132,000 people have accessed the article. And so, and this is being able to be accessed worldwide wherever there's access to the internet. So it just really speaks to when people participate in research and the research is disseminated through articles that there is really a significant impact in terms of getting the information out there to other providers and families. So we now want to transition a little bit into, talking about how you can be informed consumers of research and thinking about what goes into a research study. And then we'll talk a little bit more about different types of research and study designs, talking about how to consider in terms of interpreting the research, and then applying what was learned from the research study. So basically what I want to start with is this idea of the cycle of what happens in research. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about each of these different steps. So the first step, or the first stage, is this stage we call design and discovery. So this is, planning the research project. Obviously, then there's a little bit more in terms of planning and funding the project, and then gathering and analyzing data, and then publishing and disseminating results. And hopefully those results then lead to more ideas and more research that further investigates new questions and goes deeper into other questions, and the cycle continues to lead to improved knowledge. So there's a couple things that are really important in that, there are some research studies that are fast and quick, and others that take years in terms of each of these steps moving forward. And then both medical and non-medical stakeholders have really important involvement in all of these different stages of research. And one of the changes in research, I think, that's happened over the last decade is agencies and the researchers themselves have realized the importance of having involvement of families and stakeholders in terms of designing the research questions. What are questions that are important to families and to the people who have the conditions and their families? And then what is also, in terms of having those stakeholders involved all the way through the process of planning the research and supporting it as well. And so, there are many times now on our research studies where we will have boards and committees of family members and stakeholders that help us guide and give feedback all the way through the processes from the design to the dissemination. So talking a little bit about just designing a research study, the questions we ask ourselves are, what do we already know? And then what are the next questions that we need to learn that are both important, obviously, and that we can actually test? And so this is sometimes the trickiest part of getting to a research study is let's get to the specific question. And then when we're deciding how we best answer the question, we want to think about the type of the research study. There's many different research approaches and research types of research studies that Dr. Davis will talk about in a little bit. And so we will decide which type of research study best answers that questions and the methods we're going to use. And then obviously we work on writing a research protocol to be able to detail all of the questions and the ideas in terms of the design. Following that, the important piece is finding funding for the study. Some research is less expensive, but most of the time there are definitely research costs associated with it, with doing a study. Funding can come from lots of different sources, all the way from foundations and different organizations, through grants from institutions, through state and federal grants, and then sometimes there are industry-sponsored studies, which means a pharmaceutical company or a biotechnology company might be funding the study to help evaluate one of their products that they would like evaluated as well in larger groups. I will say and want to talk a little bit about some of these state and federal grants because we are highlighting a lot of those in the study today, in that, the NIH and the CDC and another group called PCORI are all very, taxpayer-funded organizations. And, obtaining grants through the NIH and the CDC and some of these studies that we'll be talking about are, it has been a recent increase in terms of the amount of funding that these agencies have been supplying for research on X and Y chromosome variations. And this has been something that's been really positive in the field, and I think is also really important to highlight that we have, we're very happy that they've been emphasizing and been funding our studies. When grants are given through the NIH or CDC or other federal grants, they are reviewed very carefully by very expert panels of reviewers, and usually only the top 10% of all the grants that are submitted are actually funded. And so when these are funded through these agencies, I think it's one thing to say that families can be pretty confident that the methods being used in the study are methods that have been reviewed by many different scientific experts around the country, and we're again very enthusiastic about the amount of federal funding that has been increasing in recent years for these conditions. In addition to the funding, then next steps is getting ethical and scientific approvals for the study. And so at any academic institution, there are boards that are called the Institutional Review Boards, or the IRBs, and they are the boards that make sure that the clinical research studies are both scientifically ethical to conduct, meaning that the approach to it is going to help answer the questions, and that also the participants in the study are being protected in terms of the approach to research. And so they make sure that the rights and privacy of human subjects and the plan that the researchers have for how they're going to protect those rights is all spelled out and is acceptable in terms of current ethical research standards. Other regulatory bodies also are present depending on the institution, but generally every study that participants are involved in should be approved by an institutional review board. The next step is, collecting and analyzing the data in the study. So this includes, a big research team that's involved in the project, different processes and procedures depending on the study itself. The participants in the study, recruiting the different participants who are going to be in the study, and then different aspects of storing and managing the data, and then followed by, after collecting the data, the statistical analysis. And this is the process that usually also takes a very long time in terms of some of the studies, in terms of being able to collect the data that's needed to have the power statistically to do a good analysis. And then finally, after the studies are completed, the idea is that, the study's done, and then the knowledge that's learned from the study needs to be shared. And so it's shared in many different ways. It's shared through posters and presentations at national scientific conferences. It's shared through the publication of papers in medical journals and in other journals. And then hopefully also shared in ways that are very accessible to families through news media or other online and social media types of presentations where families can access both the scientific presentation of the study, but also a layman's interpretation of what that study has concluded and has found. Oh yeah, and then there is also, another big push over the last decade where, federally funded studies for sure are all required to share data with their data set with people who inquire after the study. And so there's a lot of big databases now that if the study is funded by taxpayers, really, after the investigators have done their initial analysis and publications, that it's required that they make that data set available for other researchers who are interested to be able to analyze different questions or do different analyses on that data set. And so we are very enthusiastic about that because we're learning, and people can continue to learn from the data that's already been collected in previous studies, so that the cost of doing those studies again doesn't have to be replicated. And then finally, this is just a little bit of information about the upcoming AXYS conference that we discussed that's coming up in Atlanta from June 28th to 30th. there are many, many, many different presentations that are going to be going on at the conference, but to highlight some of the current research and the research presentations that are going to be there on Saturday, June 29th, there's a presentation by Dr. Rebecca Wilson, who's one of the psychologists here in the Extraordinary Kids Clinic, about just how research can benefit patients and families. And then keynote addresses by a big panel of researchers nationally from all across the United States, most of these with, very active research projects and federally funded studies that talk about all the different variations. And so these panels are going to be really a nice way to highlight all the current research and what's going on, so families can learn about current research and current findings. And then on Sunday, June 30th, there's a poster session, which is a session in which the researchers put up pretty big posters about either recent findings or current studies that are ongoing, and families have the opportunity to go around to all the different posters that they're interested in, to hear about the research findings, and then to talk to the researchers about their results and how they may interpret it for their own child, and then also about opportunities for participation in research.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about different types of research and study design. So again, under the whole heading of how you can be an informed consumer of research that's out there. So when we're talking about clinical research, again, research with humans or patients, we have this pyramid of essentially different types of study designs. So way down at the bottom of this pyramid here is really not even true research. It's more opinions and editorials. Still important to bring up ideas and topics and maybe anecdotal experience, but often not done in an actual scientific fashion or a systematic fashion, as we talked about earlier, so usually not true research. Then we have case reports. So case reports are reporting usually on one or two or sometimes a case series, so a few different patients, but again, mostly just observations of that particular patient in that particular circumstance. And so again, really important to spark new ideas and to generate new questions and to raise new topics, but potentially not generalizable to other people who aren't in that situation. The next one up above case reports is more systematic and more rigorous. So looking what we call case control. So comparing cases or individuals with a particular condition, let's say an X and Y chromosome variation, compared to controls, someone that doesn't have that X and Y chromosome variation, but otherwise looks the same. So by that I mean, like, if you're looking at XYY syndrome, they're all males, so you would pick controls that are males of a similar age to the group that you're looking at. So the case control studies also are usually one point in time where they're comparing some sort of outcome between these two different groups or sometimes several different groups. You can also do a type of case control study would be to look at different X and Y chromosome variations and have 3 different groups, for example, and be comparing them. Cohort studies is the last of that falls under this observational study group. So all of these observational studies, we're observing or gathering information from the participants, but we're not actually intervening or doing anything to the participants. These are cohort studies, and typically cohort studies are followed over time. So you don't have data just at one time point, but you have it over a number of time points, or at minimum 2 different time points, so you can look at how things change in the setting of different environments. Then we move on to the experimental studies, and the one that most people think about are randomized controlled trials. So these we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, but they're essentially they're doing an intervention that's done in a randomized fashion, and usually with a placebo or a second intervention as well that it's compared to. Quasi-experimental studies include lots of different things that essentially includes an intervention but isn't necessarily a randomized controlled trial. So these might be looking at an intervention within one group but not having a control group that doesn't get that intervention. Then above these studies, above the experimental studies, are really research that's done that's combining all of the studies that have been done thus far. So systematic reviews is a specific type of review. It's not just a basic review that often includes a lot of opinion and whatnot. systematic reviews really go to the literature and really describe their methods of how they looked at all of the different research that has currently been published and what specific study designs they were looking at and that they included in their systematic review, and often will merge these data together to be able to come up with a kind of conclusion overall. And meta-analyses are even one step above that. So usually when we have multiple high-quality studies that have already been done, but maybe show different information because they may be in different circumstances. So meta-analyses are at the very peak of this triad, or this triangle. So when we look specifically at the X and Y chromosome variations, this is just to highlight how much more research is really needed. So when I went to PubMed, which is one of the most common search engine for looking for research studies, the original research, and looked for XYY syndrome, studies that have been published in the last 20 years, there's a total of 83 publications. Not all of these are actually specific to XYY, but they come up when you search for them, so I included them all in here. You can see here that the large majority of these studies are all down really in this case reports and opinions and editorials and maybe you know, some case control studies, but certainly no experimental studies have been done. And of these studies, so in the systematic review and the meta-analyses, these are not specific to XYY. They were actually on prenatal testing, and one was on infertility in all men, and so it was looking at different methods for that. So again, the bottom line here is that the majority of the studies that we're dealing with in X and Y chromosome variations are usually down at the lower end of the kind of quality of evidence, and that just means we really need a lot more research done in these areas. The observational studies and, again, even opinions and editorials are still important to have in the literature, but it's just important to understand when you're consuming this research, when you're looking at the research studies have been done, you have to ask yourself what type of research it was. So just a couple examples of the randomized controlled trials, or RCT. So this is the most basic schematic for that. So we have a study group that we're interested in looking at, and at the baseline of the study, we randomize this group to either receive the intervention or to receive placebo, or a fake intervention, essentially. Usually randomization is often blinded so that the investigator and the participant doesn't know which group that they've been assigned to, although that's not always the case and not always possible. Then for some period of time, they receive this intervention in placebo, and then they come back at a later time. So these are all longitudinal studies, and some outcome of importance is measured. So these are some examples of recent or ongoing studies that have been done in XXY specifically, looking at testosterone or androgen treatment at different time periods. So Dr. Tartaglia just completed a study looking at testosterone in the early pubertal period in boys with XXY. Dr. Ross completed a study a few years ago of oxandrolone in XXY in childhood, and those results are largely published at this point. And then I'm currently doing a study looking at testosterone in the infancy period, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Examples of some observational studies that you might see. So I did a study looking at cardiometabolic health in adolescents with XXY compared to male controls that did not have XXY. And this is an example of what you might see for when you're looking at data from a case control study. So you have a control group, and then you have your study group, and you can be comparing some outcome, and you may have results that look like this, or a bar graph or something along those lines. So they're just at one time point, you're looking at a difference. There's also currently a neuroimaging study going on at the NIH that's a case control design as well. When we're looking at cohort studies, so these are, again, longitudinal studies that have some sort of time that goes through the study. There's a study that is currently going on, brain and behavior during puberty in Klinefelter syndrome, and the Extraordinary Baby study that we'll talk about at the end of this presentation as well. And these studies, since we're looking over time, we can see here, this is just one example of some outcome, and then time is on the x-axis, and you're seeing these different trajectories of these different groups over a period of time. So this is an example of what data from a cohort study may look like. All right, so then we wanted to talk a little bit more, again, being an informed consumer of research, of not just reading the headlines, but really learning a little bit more about what that means and why that's important. So headlines are meant to catch your attention and to really engage the readers, and therefore they purposefully overstate often the evidence that was found in the study. These aren't related to XXY, but these are just, or X and Y chromosome variations, but these are just examples from that people have put together of headlines that really didn't match up with the study reality. So this is a headline: "New cure for baldness could be found in existing drug." In reality, the drug that actually has a lot of different side effects, so probably would never be used for something as benign as baldness, was found in the lab to have an effect on hair follicles. It was never even used in humans to try to grow hair, for example. This other one headline says, "Sugar improves memory in over 60s, helping them work smarter." This was a very short-term study in a controlled setting in the lab, where they gave a type of sugar to participants and then did one specific test, but there was no measurement included of working smarter, and there was no long-term sort of interventions are actually applicable to real life as part of this study. And then finally, probiotics could help millions of patients suffering from bipolar disorder. It's, again, attention grabbing. In reality, this study had only 33 people that were recruited to participate in this study right after a hospitalization for a manic episode, and they received probiotics and had a positive response. But this was not then duplicated in much larger studies. So these are just examples of how you can't always just hang on what the headlines say. So then what do you do then if you can't just rely on the headlines or the title of the study or the paper? So looking at, we dive into this a little bit because often we have families that will bring us actual research papers that have been written by other researchers, and I want to be able to give you guys a little bit of information of kind of what is the structure of a research article that you might be reading. So a primary research article is really an original report of research, ideally results, that chronicle the way that it was done so that it can then be replicated again by a different scientist. We typically will have 4 different sections for research papers. There can be a little bit of variability in here, but the first section is really the introduction or the background that describes what is already known, why you came up with your question, and kind of what was the purpose of the study overall, the big picture. The methods is really the meat of what was done, all of the details of how it was done, and that is really what someone can then replicate if they wanted to do this study again. Results then is the meat of it, what was found after you followed those methods, and then the discussion and conclusion is really interpreting it in the context of what do these results mean, what are some of the limitations and the strengths of this study, and kind of what are the next steps as well. All right, so the full paper has the details that you might want to look into. Again, titles and abstracts really only have limited information, and the details can be really important to understanding whether or not this study is applicable to your situation. There are really strengths and limitations to every study, and every good study should include these in the full paper in that discussion section as well. It's also important for the reader to understand what these strengths and weaknesses are. Bias or a type of prejudice is a limitation for every study, and there's biases in all parts of the study as well. So there's each study design, the different studies that we went through have different strengths and weaknesses and different biases that are involved in that. Certainly down at the case report level, that has the most biases because there's not really a lot of structure to those at all. Who the study population is and who's recruited to the study, there's a lot of what we call ascertainment bias in studies, particularly in X and Y chromosome variations, both because a lot of individuals may not be diagnosed, so we're not capturing the whole population. And then of those that are diagnosed, who decides to participate in research studies is potentially a bias because not everyone will either elect to participate or can afford to participate. A lot of them, are done in centers that may not be all over the globe. You kind of can't do a study in the middle of northern Michigan, where there's very few people, for example. So it doesn't necessarily include everybody to have access to the studies. Obviously, you can minimize some of these biases by trying to provide travel reimbursement for participants and things like that. Who pays for the study can bias both the study design and potentially the study results and how the study results are interpreted, and then overall the goals of the researcher and the research team, particularly if the research team has a specific agenda in wanting to, prove their theory correct, and that they have influence over any of the testing or the results that could be potentially subjective. So those are all things to think about, just examples of how a study can potentially be biased. Again, hopefully, if you're doing good study designs, you can eliminate some of those biases by really carefully thought out studies, and particularly studies like Dr. T was saying that are funded by, and the small number of studies that do get funded by bodies like the NIH and the CDC are kind of vetted for a lot of those biases already. The next thing we have is just realizing that each of the studies that you might read may or may not apply to your situation. So how generalizable the study is really depends upon how the study was conducted, who participated in the study, and were they actually things that could be then applicable to you. So overall, the whole take home for this is in addition to, you can certainly read these articles yourselves, but if you're not scientists or you're not in the medical field, I think making sure that you feel empowered to take this to your medical doctor or to your child's medical doctor so that they can help you interpret these research articles and their findings and how they apply to you or your child and the care that you're receiving. All right. I think you're going to start now.
Yeah. So, we talked a lot about some of the thoughts and considerations, not in any way to discourage people from participating or being skeptical about research, but just to be thinking about, there are limitations and what research answers and how it can apply to you and you, as an individual. But, one of the goals of this presentation is really to help empower and encourage families and individuals in the X and Y chromosome variation community to participate in research. And so we want to just share a few different aspects in terms of, why do people actually participate in research to think about. So basically, one of the main reasons people would likely participate in research and that they have is the idea that they're improving their own health or their own outcomes. And so this can be through studies that may monitor, different aspects of growth or development or aspects of health. It also helps participants oftentimes learn about their own condition and learn from the researchers that are doing the studies, who are often obviously some of the experts in terms of that condition. And then, also to have access to either the assessments that are conducted through the research study and or the interventions that are being studied. And in some of these situations, for example, industry-sponsored trials, sometimes that intervention is only available as a, experimental medication through that study, or they may be specialized interventions that are being designed specifically for the X and Y chromosome variation, in which case, it may not be available yet in standard practice. And so, overall, families find a lot of possibilities in terms of their own personal benefit from participating in the study. These are some quotes from different families who participated in one of Dr. Davis's study when she surveyed the families afterwards about participation and talking about what the benefits were. I've learned a lot about the condition. I'm, appreciative of having a child followed by a team of knowledgeable professionals. It's very valuable, provides a lot of support. And then other ideas like taking action makes families feel empowered to do everything they can to help their child. And then really to help being able to care for their kids, both individually in terms of improving their own health, but also contributing to the idea that they're contributing to medical knowledge for the future. That's another big reason we hear often, and that families will report participating in research, is this idea of altruism, just, giving of themselves to advance knowledge in general in terms of medical knowledge about the conditions. And so I have so many families who come and tell me that the reason they're participating is because their child is doing awesome and doesn't have a lot of challenges, and or has some challenges, but not to the severity of what a previous, research or stigmatized view of Klinefelter syndrome or some of the other X and Y variations such as XYY may be. My son with XYY, when he was born, they told me he was going to be a criminal, and he's the furthest thing from it. He may have some of his own challenges in learning, but there is not a bad bone in this kid's body. And so, I think a lot of times there's families who participate to, advance knowledge and make sure what's really out there is reality. And so these are some of the other quotes from families as well. I think there's so much misinformation about XXY or XYY in all of the research. And then we want to be able to have new sources that are available to those who are newly diagnosed. And so, there's a lot of this type of approach, and this is what we feel is really important. Like those original 35 people in the Trisomy X study that really have, gave of their time and their information to be able to help hundreds of thousands of people around the world. So let's say you're interested in participating in research. How do you find the opportunities that are available? Well, the first place to look is on the AXYS website. This is the website that many of you probably found the information about this webinar on at genetic.org. And there's actually an area under the resources tab that says clinical research and clinical trials right at the top, and then the menu of research opportunities for families. So you can click there. And then what it brings you to is the research opportunities for families page, which currently has 11 different studies listed for individuals all the way from birth to adulthood for all the different X and Y chromosome variations, from the more common trisomies to the less common tetrasomy and pentasomy conditions. And then they are all across the United States. And even two of the studies are listed, are international sites that are going on in both the UK and the Netherlands. And so I'm sure if there are people watching this from UK or Canada or other locations across the world, there are also similar types of advocacy organizations that have research studies listed in your area as well. When you click into the actual studies themselves, this is just an example of a study going on that's being sponsored, and the PI is Dr. Ross at Nemours. And it's a study on learning and brain development in boys with XYY syndrome. And basically what you'll see is for each study, which variations are being studied. Sometimes there's just one, sometimes there's many. What gender is being studied, the age range, and then other eligibility requirements, if you have to travel, and other information. And then there's usually a link to the actual flyer or website for the study, and then contact information if you're interested to get more information. Another site for identifying where to find research opportunities is clinicaltrials.gov. This is sponsored by the NIH. So again, all of these trials have been not all funded by the NIH, but any clinical trials that are going on, even sponsored by pharmaceutical companies and other things, are required to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So this is a really important resource for looking for studies, and it includes studies from all around the world. When you log into the website, there's an area that says find a study, and you can choose if you want to find studies that are recruiting or all the different studies, and then you type in here the condition or the disease that you're looking for, and then obviously you press search. So when you type in trisomy X or triple X, there's actually 5 studies that were found, and then it brings you to the list of the studies. And so what you can see from there are obviously the title of the study in terms of what the study's name is. This is the one from us that our Extraordinary Baby study will talk about. This is the NIH study, and this is a study that you can see was on high-risk multiple gestations that include trisomy X along with other sex chromosome abnormalities and the trisomy 13, 18, and 21 conditions. But what you can also see in this is whether or not the studies are actively recruiting or whether or not they're completed. And then it obviously shows you if there's interventions and then locations of where the study's being performed. If you search for the other conditions, you'll find, for example, if you search for XXY, you find 12 studies, but if you search for Klinefelter syndrome, you find 30 studies. So it is important to think about, that some of these studies may be indexed or coded in different ways, so you might want to search using multiple terms if your condition has multiple terms. And then there's 2 studies for XXYY, 3 for 49XY, 6 for XYY, and so you can see, and then 210 studies for sex chromosomes. So there may be some studies in here that actually pertain to this group as a whole. So there's many different ways to search for the study. When you click into a study, basically it gives you even more details that you can review, so you can see if it's something you may be interested in participating in. So generally there's a study brief summary of the study. So this study at the NIH talks about that there's going to be MRIs and why MRIs are used to study brain anatomy. And then it goes on to give you, if you go and scroll down, other details of the study, such as very specifics of the study designs, like Dr. Davis previously described, what their enrollment goals are, including the numbers that they want to enroll, the different groups they're enrolling, what the outcome measures are that they're using in the study. Many times this is usually just their primary outcome measures of what they're looking at, and a lot of studies include other outcome measures, but it includes their primary, measurements, and what they're doing, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are, or who's eligible for the study, age groups, and different aspects of, maybe past medical history or other things like that. And then obviously the important piece as well is the contact information to have additional questions answered if that is not in the study description itself.
All right, so then after you've identified a study that you might be interested in participating in, or one of your kids might be interested in participating in, then what are the next steps? First, I think contacting the research team to learn more about the study and get more information, reviewing any study information that you might already have, including some studies have a website that you can sometimes get through the AXYS website or from clinicaltrials.gov, or sometimes just Google as well. Study flyers that maybe pointed you in the direction of the study, or other information that you might have. All studies that enroll participants so that you're actively involved in the research study, collecting data from you as a participant, should include a consent form, which we'll talk about in more detail. So having time to review the consent form is really important, and then asking what questions you might have about the research study. So what questions you should consider asking if you're asked to be in a research study, or if you're considering being in a research study. I'm not going to read through all of these, but this will be, available for you to take a look at a little bit later, and we could even put together a little handout that could go on the AXYS website as well. But some of the different things to consider, why are they doing this study? And do you personally feel that it's important to be a part of this study after learning more about it? Who's all going to be in the study, and do I even qualify for it? So again, those inclusion and exclusion criteria. A little bit more into kind of the details of the study. What will it involve? How long will it last? Do I have to pay for it? Will I be paid for it? What information will I get out of it? Potential benefits and risks, and all those things are really important questions for you to ask if you're considering whether or not you want to participate in a research study that's going on. So a little bit more about the informed consent, because I think this is a really important part of any research, again, that involves any sort of patients or human subjects in general. So informed consent refers to the process of learning about key facts of a trial or a study before you decide whether or not to participate. It is, however, not just this consent document. We often talk about signing a consent document. That's important, but it also continues throughout the study as well, making sure that participants understand what is part of the research study and also understand their rights as a research participant well after they've signed this consent form. The goals of informed consent start when or include the researcher explaining the details of the study to help give more information to decide if you want to participate in the study or not. This includes the purpose of the study, how long the study lasts, what procedures are required, the risks and benefits of the study, and of course key contacts for you to be able to have and follow up with if you have more questions later on. The participant then decides, after they have, had an opportunity to hear about the study and to get all these pieces of information and to take time to read this consent form and ask the questions, any more questions that they have, the participant then decides whether or not they want to participate in the study. And if they do want to participate in the study, they sign the study document. If you're under 18, this is something that we have to have parents sign, but we also want to involve the kids if they're old enough at a developmentally appropriate level to understand that they're participating in the research as well, or helping others and what they're being asked to do as well. But if they're under 18, then the parent ultimately gets to decide. The kid can't elect to participate in the study if the parents don't approve, for example. It's also important to know that the consent form is not a contract, and the participant can withdraw from the study at any time or say that they no longer want to continue the study. And then the participant gets a copy of this consent form so that they, again, have all that detailed information, and they also have the contact information for them to follow up as well. So you should be able to have access to a consent form or your consent form if you've participated in any studies previously. This is just an example here. I know you can't read this, but there's a total of 12 pages to the consent form, so it's a pretty in-depth document, and some consent forms are potentially even longer than that. It can include a lot of language that we try to make understandable, but sometimes things have to be put in there because we are required to use this particular language that maybe isn't even specific to our study, but just universal. And so it's really important to feel empowered if you don't understand something in the consent form to ask the researcher, what does this really mean, and how does this affect me? All right, so then that brings me to the next slide here of your rights as a research participant. And a lot of these things we've already gone over in the questions that you would ask and that are really important. But it's important for you to know this is not specific to our research or X and Y research. This is, you could Google this information about, your rights as a research participant. But ultimately, you have the right to enough time to decide whether or not you want to participate in this study and to make that decision without any pressure from the researchers. For example, you wouldn't want to, some research studies that are maybe done in the emergency room and you have to make a decision pretty quickly are a different story. But most of the research that involves X and Y chromosome variations, you should have ample time to be able to ideally read the consent form and talk about the study before you even go to the study site to participate in the study. You also have the right to, stop being in the study at any time, to be told all of this information about the study, and then to, again, receive a copy of the consent form. So now we're going to talk about some of the current studies that we're doing here in our group to kind of give you an idea of what is available out there, and to also demonstrate a little bit more about, what research looks like and current research that's ongoing in X and Y chromosome variations. So I'm going to talk about the TESTO study, and then Dr. T is going to talk about the Extraordinary Baby study and the TRIXIE study. We also have an ongoing clinic registry and database, so patients that are seen in our clinic have the option to participate in research as well, particularly some of the rarer conditions that maybe we don't have a lot of research on, and so the just observational from the clinic sample is still really important data to be able to get and research to be able to do as well. So that is available to some of our clinic participants, but unfortunately we don't have funding to pay for those participants to come here. Those are just ones that are in our research or clinical program already. All of our studies and information about our clinic can be found on our website at extraordinarykidsclinic.org, and you can email extraordinarykidsclinic@childrenscolorado.org for if you're interested in participating in any of these studies, and we'll get back to you. So the first study, TESTO, is testosterone effects on short-term outcomes in infants with XXY. So this is a study that is based on, and the background of this is that boy infants are having a mini puberty period or a surge in their testosterone levels in the first few months of life. And there is some background information to support that maybe boys with XXY do not have quite as high of testosterone surge. And this testosterone surge is probably really important for programming not just immediate effects in infancy, but long-term effects as well. And so potentially a kind of a critical window of testosterone exposure and development. So this study builds on that and is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that we are currently recruiting for. So infants that are prenatally identified to have XXY or Klinefelter syndrome. We then have them enroll between 4 and 12 weeks of age, so very little babies that come visit us in Denver for their first study visit. At their first study visit, after it's complete, they are randomized by a process that I'm not involved in as the investigator, the families aren't involved in. They're randomized to either the first group on the left here, over here, or the second group, and it's randomized 1-to-1. So half of the kids are in this group and half of the kids are in this group. The first group here is receiving testosterone in the first half of the study. And the second group here is receiving what's called a placebo, so kind of a fake medicine, or it's a saltwater medicine in the first half of the study. They then come back for their second visit here, where we're measuring the same outcomes we did in the first visit. And this first half of the study is a true, randomized controlled trial that I talked about previously. They then essentially cross over. So if they didn't receive testosterone in the first half of the study, they then receive it in the second half of the study. And the kids that did receive testosterone first then received placebo. Again, I don't know at this point who's received what, and the parents don't know either. And so we can collect outcomes at these different time points that are what we call blinded, so we don't know who's received these treatments. These are examples of some of the outcomes that we're looking at. So we are looking at body composition, or the amount of body fat that these babies have, through something called the P-POD, which Dr. T will show a picture of in a second here. We also do a history and physical exam, a developmental assessment. We collect blood and urine, and we do safety questionnaires. The whole goal here is to understand these, immediate effects of testosterone in infancy, to make sure that it's safe as well, because that's an important part of the study. And then also to look at, okay, if we do see benefits at this first follow-up visit, so this visit 2 here, then is it sustained in the second half of the study when they're no longer getting testosterone? So is that still continued, or do those benefits kind of fade away when they're no longer getting testosterone? So again, this study is funded by the NICHD, so a branch of the NIH, and we pay for travel to Denver and a night in a hotel. We give you the results of the developmental assessments. You obviously get testosterone as part of the study, and the study is currently recruiting.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this study we call the Extraordinary Baby Study. And this study, really, the goals of this study are to help families when they ask us questions related to what the outcomes of their infants with a prenatal or early diagnosis of an X and Y variation may be. And so this comes up all the time in clinic in terms of we know there's a lot of variability in the outcomes of individuals with X and Y variations. Some of them, have definitely above average to quite exceptional outcomes. And then there are some individuals who have more areas of challenge. And so, one of the questions that everyone would like to be able to answer is, how can we predict, or are there ways to predict from infancy, how to, or what these outcomes are going to be, and what the factors are that determine these outcomes. So this is the kind of picture from birth to adulthood that you saw before, and what we're really trying to do is help guide and be able to answer some of these questions for families, and also to be able to help providers, medical providers and genetic counselors, have more information about our population, to be able to guide families when they have a new diagnosis. And so, as many of you know, there is a very significant increase in the rate of prenatal genetic testing going on, since there has been a blood test available to test the genetics of the baby in the pregnant mothers. And with this, we've been identifying a lot more infants in the prenatal period than have ever been identified before. And so there's definitely a surge of infants being born with X and Y chromosome variations, and this study is a new round of those kind of birth cohort studies to really describe a whole new cohort of prenatally diagnosed infants the goal is from birth to adulthood. This is a really complicated diagram that's actually part of the grant proposal that really is our diagram of how we conceptualize the study and what we hope to obtain from it. So I'm not going to go through all the details in here, but basically this study involves primarily the sex chromosome trisomies, but really all the different variations. And then what we're looking at in the study are what are potential risk or protective factors and early predictors of different outcomes of the study, all the way from early childhood through, hopefully, as we study and follow these individuals through the lifespan, through school age and adolescence, and then into adulthood. And the different outcomes that we're looking for range from all sorts of different neurodevelopmental and cognitive and social, emotional outcomes to cardiometabolic and health outcomes, and then later on, you know, really to some of these other health and learning and cognitive outcomes and quality of life outcomes as we go on. So our Extraordinary Baby study is the first phase of what are, you know, hopefully long-lasting and long-funded studies, and our outcomes from the infants are to look at outcomes at 3 to 5 years of age and see what we can identify in terms of predictors of the variability of outcomes in this group. So basically the design of this is a longitudinal cohort study. It's also funded through NICHD and is really part of a really nice network of studies that are evaluating newborn screening and considering whether or not Klinefelter syndrome and other X and Y variations may be candidates for newborn screening. And so we're really proud to be part of this group called the NBSTRN. When infants enroll, they have to have a prenatal diagnosis, and then they enroll sometime before the 12-month age group. So they come in either starting at 2 months or starting at 6 months or starting at 12 months, depending on when they contact us and when they can first come in for the study. And then after that, they're followed yearly for study visits. Our goal is to enroll 200 infants with a prenatal diagnosis of the different X and Y chromosome variations. And the protocol, when you come for a study visit, includes a lot of different aspects of measurement. So we do developmental assessments looking at language and cognitive and motor skills as the kids get older. We're looking at hormone profiles, so there are blood draws involved in terms of looking at many different aspects of hormonal functioning. We're also looking and banking DNA and RNA and urine and stool to do a lot of other types of studies to combine those biologic factors. This is a picture of the little pea pod where we look at body composition and can tell fat and muscle ratios. And then we're also doing eye tracking in collaboration with Dr. Sophie van Rijn in the Netherlands. And this is to actually on the screen, we show the baby's different social scenes and different scenes and pictures, and then we can see from the technology that we have where the babies are looking and what they're paying attention to, and this will help us analyze kind of early aspects of what's important in terms of their social attention. In the baby study, it's actually being conducted at 2 sites. Our site is the primary site in Colorado, and then the primary site on the East Coast is at Nemours DuPont and in Philadelphia with Dr. Judy Ross. And so this is nicely spread out to hopefully be able to enroll participants across the United States easily. At the end of the study, we do share the results of the developmental evaluations and, you know, provide some recommendations related to care and next steps when needed to be able to share with primary providers and the medical and psychological follow-up teams that may be going on at your own, you know, for your own doctors and your own providers. In Colorado, we're also participating in a site in the TRIXIE study, which is a study that the PI is Dr. Van Rijn in the Netherlands at University of Leiden. And this study, TRIXIE stands for trisomy of the X and Y chromosome. So this is a study evaluating neurodevelopment, not just in prenatally diagnosed, but both prenatal and postnatal diagnosis of the different trisomies, all the way from age 1 to age 6. And there are many similar goals in terms of the idea of identifying predictors of outcomes in social development and language and behavioral regulation as well. For this TRIXIE study, we're currently very actively enrolling patients specifically with XYY and trisomy X. Our XXY groups have already been filled or are scheduled. Those who are scheduled are already scheduled, but we are definitely looking for more participants who have XYY and trisomy X. They can enroll either anywhere from 12 months of age to 5 years of age for this study. The site in the United States is in Colorado, here in Denver. There are also sites going on both in Leiden and Belgium as well, but obviously American participants would come to our site. And there's 2 visits in this study. There's the baseline visit, and then you return 1 year later. Travel costs are also included in these studies. When we talk about travel costs being included, I just want to make sure that we mention that, you know, there are definitely some restrictions and limitations in terms of travel costs. So we don't pay for first-class air travel. These are all federally funded NIH tax dollar studies, so we have to be very careful with tax dollar money, and we do sometimes have some restrictions in the amount of tickets and the amount of money we can spend. But we discuss that with everybody before you come. In the TRIXIE study, there are also developmental assessments that are conducted, and you get reports after each study visit. You undergo questionnaires and interviews as from parents' perspective, and then the kids have different play sessions that they participate in. And then one of the really nice strengths of this study is that there is a big emphasis on true biomarkers or biological factors that are looking at predictors of outcomes, also including eye tracking, and then some aspects of true physiology, looking at things like skin conductance and heart rate, and how infants and young kids are physiologically or physically reacting to some of these different play situations and other things too. So it's really, I think, a very nice strength of the study is in terms of including this neurobiology and physiology. Okay. So then I think that concludes really our presentation. We first just want to say a huge thank you to all the participants who have been part of our studies. Thank you to all of you for listening. Some of this has included a lot of detail, but we get a lot of these questions that we felt like a webinar would be a really good place to present. And so we really appreciate the attendees and then the participants in all of our research studies. And this is our research team and clinical team here in Colorado. We have a great Extraordinary Kids Clinic group, and I am very appreciative to this group because they are really awesome in terms of our clinical care and our research activities. So now I think we're open for questions that have come up through the webinar, and I think people have typed things in. And if there are questions, we can definitely answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. T, and thank you so much, Dr. Davis. This was a fantastic webinar full of wonderful information. And AXYS, yes, we try to share research recruitment. We'd love to have people be a part of that. And we also try to share the results of the research. So thank you so much for this. I have a question here. It says, is there any suggestions on how parents or individuals can request different research studies be started? Is there a place that requests can be sent, or how do you find out, why certain research questions are not being investigated?
That's a really good question. Back to the, start of that research cycle that Dr. T was talking about, and really involving families and communities from the very beginning of kind of what are those important questions, I think is a really important step. There are some opportunities that come about. So sometimes before we do a research study, for example, we might send out a survey about like the priorities of patients and families. AXYS usually facilitates sending those out. So, definitely fill out any surveys that you might be offered, because I think that that's a place that researchers will often go to see kind of what is the interest in this and is this important to the community. I think that there's also some initiative, as Dr. T was saying, for PCORI is Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Initiative, and AXYS in combination with Dr. Sharon Close put together an engagement award that they got a few years ago that essentially did just that. It brought together families and other stakeholders, individuals with X and Y chromosome variations, and researchers, and maybe clinicians that aren't involved in research but still care for these patients, all to the table to really discuss what are the gaps in research currently, and where do we want to invest time and money, and what questions really need to be answered, and what questions are important to the community. And so that was a really good avenue, although that was, I don't know that that's still an ongoing opportunity. So I don't know if Dr. T, you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, the AXYS Clinics and Research Consortium has been an effort of AXYS, and so if there are ideas of things that are important to you and questions you feel like should be answered, then I definitely would contact AXYS and let them know your ideas, and those can be shared with that whole ACRC Clinics Consortium group. Part of the challenge is then translating that into funding. So if anyone has any great funding providers out there, you know, a lot of times it takes just a little bit of pilot funding to get something going. Anywhere from, you know, a couple $1,000s to, of course, much more is always, you know, useful for research. But, you know, sometimes those efforts through fundraising, and then, you know, getting the research team to really help shape it into a question that can be answered, or that can at least start to be answered and investigated. So I would encourage anyone with ideas to definitely submit them to AXYS, and they'll bring them to the ACRC group, where we can brainstorm and figure out how we may be able to, you know, look into, or at least begin to look into some of those studies and ideas. All of my research has always been driven by what families ask me in clinic. Mm-hmm. Hey, Dr. T, is testosterone going to help my kid? Hey, Dr. T, what's going to happen to my baby? How do I know what to do? What is, you know, what is this going to make a difference? Is this going to make a difference? Does it matter if they were premature? Does it matter if, you know, my brother has a learning disability, or if my other son has autism? And so, you know, a lot of times we, you know, it's your questions that come to us that really stimulates and drives our research.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I have a next question, which is it realistic to expect that our local physician will be staying informed on current research? And what is the best way to involve your physician, or bring a research paper in and asking your personal doctor to review it?
Yeah. I think that's a really great question. I think it really depends is the answer. It depends upon, you know, how, what, you know, specialty your primary care doctor is, or what other specialists your child or you might be seeing. If it's kind of, you know, a lot of people in primary care have a lot of different conditions that they're seeing, and they have to take care of a lot of different patients in a short amount of time. And so it's probably not realistic for them to know the latest research on, you know, XXY or XYY. And I think that you can definitely be an advocate for yourself and for your child, and, you know, ideally looking into some of these things yourself. So hopefully this webinar was helpful to kind of sort through how you maybe go about doing that, finding research studies and research information. But I think bringing it to their attention is certainly reasonable. And I think most doctors are very, you know, certainly understand how to read research papers and understand the importance of research, and could certainly help you kind of figure out, is this related to something that we can apply to this situation or not? So I think, you know, some parents will just bring in actual research studies, but also giving them an opportunity to have time to read them, because you can't necessarily expect that to happen in a very short clinic visit too. So I think developing a rapport and a relationship over time is really important, because then they're probably going to invest a little bit more time and their energy into staying up to date.
Yeah. I would say, you know, in talking with a lot of families, the experience of this is that probably about, hopefully maybe 60 to 70% of the time, the physicians are very receptive and, you know, like Shanlee said, may not have time to read it right then, but are, you know, wanting to do the best that they can for treating their child. I think it depends a little bit, you know, physicians are people too, and sometimes can feel intimidated when families really know a lot more than they do. And the whole reason we started the Extraordinary Kids Clinic is I can't tell you how many times during the initial discussions with our research patients where families said, I know more. I'm the one who always has to teach the doctor or the therapist or the teacher, and when can I please just go somewhere where they actually know and have more experience than I do. So just remember that, you know, a lot of times families really come with a lot more information and knowledge about the background of rare diseases, and these are not rare, but, you know, to a lot of physicians, they are rare in their practice, than the physicians actually have. So the way you present it is obviously important too. You know, that you don't know anything about this may not get you as far as like, hey, I'm really interested in learning about this. I want to share what I found out about this with you. Can you help me understand this and what you think? And those types of approaches, I think, are important.
Thank you. I guess the last question we have here, and if anyone else has a question, feel free to type it in the question box. It is about advocating for more research. Is there something individuals should be doing? You said, obviously, if we can find money, being a part of AXYS. Is it something, you know, as we start a political season that people should be thinking about, or what would your suggestion be on that?
You know, honestly, I think there's a lot of different approaches to this, right? But to do good research, there does have to be, you know, there has to be funding. So participation in research is an important piece. And then, you know, I think there is a role for AXYS and families to come together to advocate to agencies like the NIH and the CDC and others about, you know, in some ways, some of the urgency of some of this research, especially including the idea that, you know, there are a lot more babies being born and there's really a lot of limited information out there, and the quality of what's out there, a lot of it is good, but definitely needs to be replicated in different populations or needs to be studied, you know, in a different way and in more rigorous fashion. So, you know, I would say I'm going to punt this one back to AXYS and the advocacy organizations where the researchers and the research teams all over the country will help advocate for this, but it also takes work from families and people who know people in government and different aspects of government where there can be some, you know, advocacy for, you know, really dedicating funding towards this.
All right, well, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions right now. So if there aren't any more questions, well, I would just say a huge thank you to Dr. Davis and Dr. T, and tell everyone that we're looking forward to seeing you in Atlanta and hearing the great presentations that you highlighted tonight.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. There's going to be great researchers there, so I'm excited to learn from them also.
All right, thanks, everybody. Good night.
Yeah, thank you.